Well, hello everybody. Welcome or welcome back to the channel, which is still about furniture from the past and shedding some light on the mysterious subject. And yes, normally we do literally shed light on the pieces, but I forgot to do the video until now and they need to be delivered tomorrow. And so we're going to kind of do it here at dusk in subpar lighting. But I really need to make a video about these because they are one for the record. These are a particularly interesting and high-quality example of fine domestic furniture in mahogany from the 1820s. This set of salon furniture here, what remains of a much larger set of salon furniture. And so we're dealing with the French Restoration period. We're on the tail end of Napoleonic neoclassicism, which we can sort of see in these squared backs. But now we see this graceful influence of the decorative movement of the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in the curvature, in the graceful curves, in the movement that we're going to see. And so, like usual, I do hope that you'll enjoy taking a closer look at these pieces and that we will at least preserve a digital trace of them online for everybody. But the overarching goal is to help everybody see the difference between these original pre-industrial, typically pre-1840 period pieces, which sort of hail from the time when furniture was most artistically and most skillfully produced. We want to see the difference between this type of furniture from the past and everything else usually made afterwards by or with the help of machines that we ambiguously qualify as an antique. And so, if there is a piece in here that took more effort to acquire on my part, I really don't know what it would be. I had to drive 6 hours to the western tip of Brittany in order to find these chairs, and I called the people up and asked if they still had them for sale, and they said they did, and I recognized this model as one that's basically equivalent to several other chairs like this that are conserved in the French Ministry of Culture's National Furniture Reserve. I also really appreciate these two opposing consoles here, and I noticed the sheer precision with which the sculpture here has been executed, and I noticed that that was extraordinary. And I also noticed that the sides here that frame the backs, these are actually adorned with a little bit of sculpture and molding. That's not common as well. And so I knew I was onto something, and they said that they still had the chairs and that they were on the western tip of Brittany, and I said, my God, what a coincidence. I will be driving through the western tip of Brittany tomorrow afternoon. And so I rented a van and just drove the heck across France, picked them up from these delightful people. Essentially, these did not look good in the beach house on the cliffs of Brittany overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The kids didn't want them, which was remarkable because the chairs had been in their family for, well, ever since they were made. The chairs actually come from a place called the Château Saint-Hilaire-des-Noyers, and the Abovy family, who sold me the chairs, married into this Tournoire family who owned this little chateau a long time ago. And it was a great-great-grandmother of the woman who sold them to me who had apparently performed this needlepoint work in the old chateau, as was sort of, you know, the pastime of ladies of leisure sitting around their country chateau with nothing to do. And so you might say, what are we doing in the Restoration period in the 1820s, yet we have Napoleonic bees? Well, in the 1820s, post-Napoleon, it probably wouldn't have been very kosher, you know, to display a Napoleonic symbol in your living room. But here, we're dealing with some needlepoint work that was done 40 years after the chairs were made, when Napoleon III, Napoleon's grandson, was in power. And so, say what you will about the old needlepoint and how you could probably take it off and use it as a bulletproof vest, but it's quasi-original, there's a story to it, it's very durable, and I kind of like it. So it's staying, and I believe the new owners are going to keep it. But since it's not really the original fabric, whatever, if you wanted to change it, you could. So the first thing that we see that really makes these pieces stand out to us as collectors is the redness of the mahogany. So a lot of chairs were made in mahogany at the time, and so the first thing we look for is what's the quality of the color, what's the quality of the mahogany used? That's the first thing we see, that we're dealing with some very high quality, richly red mahogany that seems to be about as attractive now as it probably originally was. So that's the first thing that's good. And now the next thing that we're going to look for is a complexity and a sophistication of design. And so on these, we don't just have a simple squared back, but rather we have a squared back that is adorned with various moldings at pretty much every opportunity, troughs, raised portions, little bits of sculpture that add a little bit of decor and complexity to what would otherwise be a simple rectangle. Then the next decorative element that really strikes us here is this motif, this design element that we see in pretty high quality backs of chairs more often than not. For as attractive as this design is, you don't see it very often, and here they seem to terminate in this particularly well sculpted little flourish of foliage. But if we look at the lotus flowers that deploy from these rosaces here, we're going to see that not only are we dealing with this rare opposing console design element, but we're also dealing with some sculpture that is particularly precise and lifelike. But nevertheless, if we pan our vision across the fronts of these pieces, back and forth, we're going to see, interestingly, that despite the perfection, we can actually see in the negative space between the lotus flowers that the wood is undulated. Those surfaces are not flat, because, of course, all of this was sculpted out by hand. And as I mentioned earlier, here in the 1820s, we're sort of between two different styles. This stark, masculine Napoleonic Empire style, very stately, these squared backs, and then something a little bit more plush, the Restoration style, with the curvature here that we're going to see on these almost one-of-a-kind armrests. I have seen that a few times in books. Can't find the image to save my life. But see, the back legs are saber legs, which are really tethered to Empire chair design, 1810. And then the front legs here are pieds jarrets, sometimes en cuisse de grenouille, or frog's thigh feet, which is a foot design that we start seeing by 1815 or so, but which is really much more characteristic of the years 1815 to 1830. And now, if we take a look at the backs of the chairs, we're going to see just this blank checkered fabric, which is kind of a traditional and boring thing to find on the backs of chairs. And that comes from the time when silk fabric was so costly to procure that the backs of the chairs would really just be finished with a simple checkered fabric. Now, in a way, that's a cost-saving strategy, but if you know the history of this type of behavior in French chairs, in these French period chairs, there's something quite homely, there's something quite charming about it. But that's what's going on. That's why we don't have needlepoint on the back. And we're also going to see a little bit of horsehair coming through, and so that's nice to see that they have been upholstered in the traditional fashion, and they're not full of, let's say, plastic mousse. Now also, behind all of these chairs, we're going to notice that there are baguettes. Within the main frame, we see that there's another frame here, and these are called baguettes in French. I guess they're just little strips of wood. But on a period chair from this pre-industrial era, we're always going to see these baguettes back here. And so sometimes when we're dealing with late 19th century, early 20th century copies, which we would really recognize right away compared to these, because the copies wouldn't have anything to do with this in terms of the color of the wood and the quality and the precision, the lifelike nature of the execution of this sculpture. So the copies would strike us right away. But practically, if we did come across a very well-made copy, one of the unlikely things for it to have would be these baguettes here. Now again, none of that is really foolproof, but when we consider the price of these chairs and the sheer expertise and mastery of this craft that would be required to make them, we understand that we're dealing with a type of fine antique here that's inherently protected against forgery. But then anyway, in French chairs, one of the concerning things that we often do is we pick them up and we look inside and we examine to see if there's any hand saw marks, and there are. And see, on these chairs in the 1820s, we're on the cusp of industrialization. So compared to a chair from the 1730s, really these are quite smooth because they're starting to have machines that were making these pieces. But nevertheless, we see a reassuring amount of woodworm damage, which I treated in France before shipping them. And then we see that the veneers are relatively thick. And so, the final thing that we see underneath the chairs are simply the numbers which were written in pencil, which seems to indicate that this really is what remains of what was a much larger set of salon furniture. And now you might wonder where the other pieces went, but back in the day with a big Catholic family in an old chateau, it wouldn't take long for all of the pieces to be divided among all of those relatives. So having four together really isn't bad. But anyway, I do hope that you've enjoyed taking a closer look at these eccentric, yet very quintessential and fine examples of this luxury domestic furniture in mahogany from Paris, pretty much iconic of the 1820s. Again, we're going to see that these pieces really hold a candle to if that's a figure of speech outside of just my mind, but I'm going to say that. They hold a candle to, they live up to many of the pieces of the same variety that we see conserved in the French Ministry of Culture's Mobilier National, and that's one of the reasons why they caught my eye and why I felt they were worth conserving, worth cleaning up, worth showing to you, and of course worth presenting for sale. So tomorrow these are out the door. They're going on a road trip to South Dakota, if you wondered. And finally, thank you all for your time, and if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel. It will greatly help this endeavor of creating an online period furniture library of the most compelling pieces that I encounter. Thank you.